one of the things that is clear in the poll is that 2/3 of Americans think that our influence around the world is far weaker at the moment than it was 10 years ago. This decline of influence is really striking. And they correlate it with over-investment in many aspects of the reaction to 9/11. I mean, the American public thinks we had to react to 9/11. They supported the reaction to 9/11, but they think we over-invested, overspent, particularly on the Iraq war, but also on the Afghanistan war, and to some extent on building alliances in the war of terrorism, and Pakistan comes to mind in that regard. But, you know, when you reflect on it, I mean, this is sort of a, you know, seemingly a finding that matches, I think, our expectation. And certainly the perception around the world is that America's influence has declined. And whether or not it's objective, I mean, that's a debatable issue. But it's fascinating to look at it through the eyes of the American public in historical perspective. And I say that because you have to remind ourselves this is a time when we're remembering that tragedy of 9/11 a decade ago. That it happened when America had just gone through the most powerful decade maybe in its history. Having won the Cold War, having seemed to have won the Gulf War after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, having built alliances, having become the only power, the superpower in the world, having experienced a period of economic expansion and prosperity, that America was at the top. How divided a country we have become. I think that's maybe something that we know about when we look at congressional politics or partisan politics or where we are today. But what we have not internalized the extent to which our public, the American public, is really truly divided on so many issues related to foreign policy, the big issues of our time, and even about facts, they are divided to this day. One thing that is striking, for example, in attitudes toward the Iraq War, a majority of Republicans believe that there was a link between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. In fact, 43% believe that Saddam Hussein gave substantial aid to Al-Qaeda to this day. A plurality of Republicans think that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction in Iraq prior to the Iraq War, whereas that's not true of independents and Democrats. And so for that reason, you find a majority of Republicans still believe that the war in Iraq was justified. A majority of Democrats and independents don't believe so. And that kind of division, that's just an example of the kind of division that you find on really major issues, including attitudes toward Islam, including attitudes toward the Arab awakening, including on the war on terrorism. One of the really striking things in the poll is that when you look at American public attitudes toward the Islamic religion, there is no question that those attitudes have become more negative over the past decade. I mean, right after 9/11, polls showed that more Americans have a positive view of the Islamic religion than negative view. And that has really changed completely over time. We've seen that change across, throughout the decade, now reaching almost a ratio of 2-to-1 among Americans having a negative view of that Islamic religion. And yet, number one, most Americans think that the terrorists that attacked America don't speak for Islam, that they're a marginal group. And yet, most Americans don't think the conflict between the West and Islam is really about values. They think it's about power and politics. And yet, most Americans don't think that the differences are irreconcilable. And more importantly, they have a relatively warm view of Muslim people and especially of Arab people. Now, what we can't tell is whether that is just a differentiation that has been there all along. Interestingly, in the early polling after 9/11, there was not a specific question about Arab people and Muslim people as such. Only recently have we started asking that question. And we found, certainly in the April poll, the first one we've done on this issue, that the American public, a majority of the American public, have a favorable view of the Arab people. And on some countries in the Arab world, they have a really favorable view. Like 70% of the American public expressed a favorable view of the Egyptian people back in April. And so, and the Islamic people in general, a plurality expresses positive view, almost half of the American public. So is this really sort of they differentiate between the ideas of the religion, or at least their conception of the religion, but they warm toward the people, or is this a function of the Arab Spring?